What is the Genocide Convention and why is Australia not following the law? The Genocide Convention was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on 9th of December 1948 and came into effect in 1951. The Genocide Convention was largely created in response to World War II, emerging from the horrors of the Holocaust, during which approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered, along with millions of others including non-Jewish victims such as Roma, Poles and Soviet prisoners of war. Undoubtedly one of the most systematic and brutal genocides in history. At the time, international law lacked an adequate description or legal definition of genocide. The term genocide was coined by a Polish-Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, in his 1944 book Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, to describe Nazi policies in occupied Europe and the Armenian genocide, and he campaigned for its recognition as a crime under international law. Interestingly, in his writings, Lemkin also linked other settler colonialism with genocide, mentioning colonial genocides outside of Europe in his writings, including in Tasmania and, quote, the natives of Australia, end quote. In a 1946 resolution, the General Assembly recognised genocide as an international crime and called for the creation of a binding treaty to prevent and punish its perpetration. Subsequent discussions and negotiations among United Nations member states resulted in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, also known as the Genocide Convention. Australia signed the Genocide Convention on the 11th of December 1948, the day it was open for signature. Eager beaver. Incidentally, this was the day after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly under the leadership of an Australian General Assembly President and an eminent overachiever who had previously been Australian Attorney General and High Court Judge, Herb Evatt. The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the most translated document in history, as awarded by the Guinness Book of Records, was drafted by 8 people under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, including a true blue Anzac, Australian military veteran and Gallipoli survivor, Colonel William Roy Hodgson. I'll do another video on our Anzac hero, Hodgie, at some stage. On the 12th of July 1949, the Commonwealth Parliament passed the Genocide Convention Act of 1949, thereby approving ratification by Australia and the notification by Australia in accordance with Article 12 of the Genocide Convention to extend the application of the Convention to all territories for the conduct of whose foreign relations Australia is responsible. The Genocide Convention was ratified, meaning that it became legally binding, by Australia on the 8th of July 1949. However, Australia, due to delays because of legal technicalities, did not enact laws domestically in Australia to make genocide a crime until 2002, when it enacted consequential laws after ratifying the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Therefore, Australia was technically in breach of Article 5 of the Genocide Convention for half a century by failing to, quote, enact, in accordance with their respective constitutions, the necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the present convention and in particular to provide effective penalties for persons guilty of genocide or of any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3. Naughty, naughty, not a good start. Fast forward to the creation of the International Criminal Court in 1998 via the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Again, Australia was an eager early adopter of the Rome Statute, and in preparation for ratifying the Rome Statute, which it did on 1 July 2002, the Australian government on the 25th of June 2002 introduced legislation in the form of the International Criminal Court Act of 2002. That contained provisions allowing Australia to comply with its international obligations on ratification by putting in place procedures to comply with requests for assistance or enforcement of sentences. The International Criminal Court Act also amended the Criminal Code Act of 1995, the Commonwealth Criminal Code, to enact the crimes punishable by the International Criminal Court as crimes in Australian law, namely genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, as well as making consequential amendments to 6 other acts. Half a century after ratifying the Genocide Convention, the Australian government thereby made genocide a crime in Australia. As former Federal Attorney-General Darryl Williams stated in the second reading speech of the International Criminal Court Act of 2002, the main purpose of Australia incorporating the crime of genocide and other crimes in the Rome Statute into Australian law was because, quote, "It is important that Australia enact laws specifically covering all of the crimes of the International Criminal Court so that we can take full advantage of the principle and protection of complementarity." Not a good impression of Mr. Williams, probably. And, said Mr. Williams, quote, "By enacting these crimes, Australia can be sure that we will be able to investigate and prosecute under Australian law persons accused of crimes within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The government believes that the establishment of the International Criminal Court is an important development to ensure that those who commit the most egregious crimes against humanity are brought to justice. It is clearly in Australia's national interest to be part of this important international effort to deter and punish those who commit atrocities." End quote. In any event, since 2002, genocide has been a crime in Australia, as well as war crimes, crimes against humanity and other atrocities. Which begs the question, when will the Australian Federal Police begin investigating Australian citizens who have served in the Israeli Defence Forces in Gaza since October 2023, during the time the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice, and multiple revered international NGOs have found that, quote, "plausible genocide," end quote, or actual genocide is being committed by Israel in Gaza. In a letter to the Australian Attorney-General in December 2023, the Australian Centre for International Justice stated, quote, "Although the Israel Defence Forces does not release official statistics in relation to serving foreign nationals, estimates stated that there could be up to 1,000 Australians currently serving in the IDF or being active reservists. Media reporting has noted that those dual Australian citizens include both reservists and active duty soldiers in the IDF, and some have indicated that they are involved in combat units. There is information to suggest that Australian citizens may also be volunteering for the IDF in a program for non-Israeli nationals known as Mahal." On the 26th of June 2024, the Jerusalem Post reported that, quote, "Since October the 7th, the Australian Border Force has questioned 3 Australian citizens suspected of departing for Israel to attempt to serve in the Israel Defence Forces." End quote. Now, Article 1 of the Genocide Convention states, quote, "The contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they will undertake to prevent and to punish." It is upon this fundamental principle that South Africa famously filed its case in the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention against the State of Israel, which has now been joined by many other countries. It is also the basis upon which the Houthis in Yemen have stated that they are engaging in attacks upon shipments headed to Israel until Israel's, quote, "crimes in Gaza stop and food, medicines and fuel are allowed to reach its besieged population," end quote. Also, there are the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. Australia, as party to the Genocide Convention, therefore has a positive legal duty to prevent and punish genocide, including investigating and prosecuting persons suspected of being involved in genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and other atrocity crimes, both at international law, that is under the Genocide Convention, the Rome Statute, but also in domestic law, namely Division 268 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code. Thus, an important question is, why is Australia not honouring its binding legal obligations to the international community and upholding the rule of law by preventing and punishing the crime of genocide in Gaza? What did the Australian government at the time it signed the Genocide Convention think a future genocide would look like, in which it would intervene and uphold the law to prevent and punish genocide that it voluntarily subscribed to. A few ways that the Australian government, on behalf of the Australian people, can honour its commitments to the international community, to the rule of law, and the international rules-based order includes 1. To intervene in the conflict in Gaza via an international display of force with other like-minded countries who want to obey the international rule of law. 2. Insist that journalists and international criminal investigators are allowed access to the Gaza Strip. 3. Issue sanctions against Israel, including a trade embargo, just like former Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke did against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and coordinated a trade embargo by the Commonwealth heads of government, and famously got into a public disagreement with UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, but which Nelson Mandela attributed as crystallising the downfall of the apartheid regime. 4. Australia could also Magnitsky Netanyahu and other Israeli government ministers and figures. I will do another video on what that means. And finally, we can also provide a safe haven to some of the innocent children, women and men who are trapped in Gaza and who can otherwise make a valuable contribution to Australian society, including regional Australia. They're just some examples of what the Australian government could be doing, whereas it now seems they are doing relatively nothing. So join us on the Seeking Justice podcast with our latest interview with UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, Professor Ben Saul, who discusses with us what Australia could and should be doing to stop breaking the law and to prevent and punish the crime of genocide in Gaza.